Hello and welcome to this video translating the fictional creation of biofoam in Halo to reality. Or possibly. Like many things in Halo, there is a grain of truth that ties the video game world to reality and avoids the need for a complete suspension of thought and disbelief. Instead, it is tied just close enough to possible reality that the ideas can be accepted without any real critical thinking. And biofoam or Medfoam from here is an example of just that. An emergency medical treatment provided to open wounds. Typically it's shown being used for large open wounds rather than pressure injuries, trauma or similar concussive damage. Although then again, individuals in such a situation are first of all unlikely to have survived, and second of all, a biofoam won't really help very much when your insides are pulped, like minced meat. And biofoam is short for biomedical foam, and it is a self-sealing, space-filling coagulant. It's also supposed to be an antimicrobial, tissue regenerative foam polymer, and used as a first aid treatment. This is a very long laundry list of things it needs to achieve already, but it keeps going. In practice, the foam is meant to be used for damaged organs and keep them where they're meant to be. Organs floating around freely, generally not good for health. It also will stop bleeding and hemorrhaging, although these two things should effectively be the same, so why the wiki bothers to separate them is confusing. Internally, the active compound or medicinal compound is morphophedamine in a polyethyl triphosphate liquid medium. That is dispensed, or more accurately distributed, using nitrous oxide. When it is applied, the polyethyl triphosphate within it and the nitrous oxide mix to create the foam, and this effect leads to encapsulation, disinfection, and numbing of wounds. You'll find it readily available in many places as either a cylindrical canister or a bottle. You'll find it often used with the deployable nozzle that is used to apply the mixture within it either directly to the affected area, for example burn wounds from plasma weapons, rubbed directly into a wound, or in some cases injected. It is accessible as a canister in various places and ways. Presumably where not found in isolation, it's part of first aid kits in the case of military facilities and vessels. As a product, a biofoam is considered an over-the-counter product. That means you can buy it and basically use it if need be, although reasons for using it should be limited, without having to have it prescribed by a physician, doctor, or similar. Or in the case of only, like to be the medic on board. All of this tells us a surprising amount about the content of the canisters of biofoam. Further, we know the effect it's supposed to have. This is all very helpful in getting a good idea about what to do with it and how to apply modern knowledge. What we know from the available information is when applied and exposed to air, the nitrous oxide and the liquid polyethyl triphosphate mix. This produces the foam as it's called. Now the foam, because of the way it functions, at least in the lore, fluff and gameplay, needs to adhere to tissues and also release the various compounds that are within it. Now we know that the compounds included are clotting factors, something to disinfect the wound, and something to numb the pain. We also know that the setup time for this to happen is relatively short, but we also know that this is not a permanent solution either. It is intended to be first aid. We know that it takes a little bit of time for the foam once it's applied to set. This leads to a semi-rigid porous mass internally, something very similar to a sponge, albeit somewhat more expanded, let's say. But on the outside, and presumably any other areas such as the internal cavities that are exposed to air, it develops a hardened skin. This is a solid seal. The standard dosage is 10 centiliters. That is 10 100 liters, so fundamentally to make it an easy number, or 1 liter, or 3.38 fluid ounces. The first few seconds of the application are known to be incredibly painful, with it describing in various ways as burning ants crawling around the wound and thousands of tiny knives stabbing into it. The biofoam doesn't have the same sort of painful sensation, let's say, when applied to an unwounded area, and this does again tell us a lot more about what's happening. As said, a biofoam is intended to be a temporary first aid solution, as it will break down over time, and so we do need to know more about what's going on internally for the chemistry to be able to get that. And generally speaking, we need to know something about the time frame for that chemistry in order to ensure a proper medical care is brought at the right time. The other thing to note here is that a biofoam can cause certain allergic reactions, and this can then lead to edema. Edema itself is not necessarily an unwanted side effect. and we'll get on that later. Just be aware that this, although it is a sort of allergic reaction, isn't necessarily bad. With a somewhat reasonably clear explanation from Halo Canon and lore of what biofoam is, what it does, and the effect's duration, we can start to break down the product in much greater detail, arguably excruciating and painful detail. First, a comparison with real-world products that exist today, or at least are developed today. We have various clotting packs, biogels, foams, and more. The clotting packs are arguably the most common and useful of these. What they're generally made from is something like a kaolin. It's a clay or a ceramic-type product that causes the activation of certain parts of the clotting cascade, and once they're started, the rest of the cascade follows through. Now, unlike the biofoam, which is sprayed into the wound, clotting packs actually packed into the wound. Basically, the wound is opened up as much as can be practically done without more damage, and it's shoved in there. Slight oversimplification, but understand that's the general gist of it. As a result, though, you do get clotting around the wound site, and thereby staunching the bleeding, in an ideal world anyway. In other instances, we have biogels. Now, the biogels are a little more complicated, mostly because the biogels that are being developed now aren't so much intended to react and stop things so much as they're meant to be relatively inert and go unnoticed by the body. The majority of these are intended to be a sort of, let's say, lubricant for artificial joints, prostheses such as hips and knees, shoulders, and so on. And so they need to be a gel, but a gel that doesn't react in any way, shape, or form. The foams and so on are very much the same. So a lot of what we have now is possibly and arguably a precursor. But what we don't have is necessarily the expanding foam feature, certainly not the antimicrobial features, we don't have the pain relief features, and there are a few other things that are missing as well, which means we now need to go into the theory crafting and speculation part of this video. We are basically going to take these existing products and trying to shove the square peg idea of biofoam into the round hole of these existing products. Starting with the basic idea of the product, an expanding foam. Expanding foams aren't new, they've been available for decades. The difference is how and if they can be used in the human body. For the most part, they can't be. It's that simple. The product is not stable in a way that is useful in the human body, and of course the same foam tends to also be toxic, or at best ineffective for its purpose. For example, if you have expanding foam used for, say, joints in a building, that's all well and good because that's reasonably stationary, certainly by comparison to the human body where everything moves all the time, and so it doesn't really get sheared, broken, or otherwise damaged. However, if you have the human body which is constantly moving, those same foams just won't be able to hold their shape. They'll be broken down by the body's movement all the time. This brings us to a modern, or at least very recent foam products that do start to fill that gap, let's say. And for the most part, we don't really have any, not in the same way we do for biofoam anyway. So we need to look at how biofoam could be made to work. Like the products that we've mentioned earlier, things like clotting packs and similar, and gels used for prostheses, we could arguably be using the, let's say, chemical and physical features of these things to make them work. So the first we have is the propellant and the expanding product. In the case of biofoam, this is achieved by the nitrous oxide in the canister being both the propellant and arguably the expanding product as well. The nitrous oxide gas both helps to propel the biofoam out of the canister, which is what you need to get it out of it. But importantly, the same gas, when a liquid trapped in the biofoam, will transition into a gas when let out of the canister. The gas, because it is a larger, physically more volume-consuming thing, expands. It literally forces the liquid to expand, just like bubbles in, say, Coca-Cola or other soft drink. The gas, once it starts to escape out of the, well, in the case of Coca-Cola, say bottle or can, is the same sort of idea here. Those small bubbles, due to the fact they can now escape, start trying to expand and get bigger. And this would help significantly in sealing the wound and providing a certain amount of structural support. It would basically be like that expanding foam used in construction and similar, just rather more appealing to the body and certainly far more functional. In that same line of thought, next we have the clotting function. Like clotting packs that are, well, filled with a platelet initiating factor, we're getting very much the same result here. The blood coagulates and stops hemorrhage, which is typically quite important in the case of soldier's injury or battle injury. Clotting packs use kaolin as mentioned to activate one of the many clotting factors. This leads to a cascade of clotting. The key difference is that clotting packs require packing in the injury, literally shoved into the open wound. In this case, a biofoam is either injected or otherwise applied directly to the wound area. It's not necessarily used in the same way a clotting pack is, which is rather more invasive. The polyethyl triphosphate is partly made up of plastic, that being the polyethylene part of the chemical name. The plastic polyethylene could in theory be used as a similar product or active ingredient as kaolin, at least in theory, and this would certainly cause the clotting cascade to start. That's at least one possible mechanism that it could create. The other itself is the polyethylene acting as a temporary patch, let's say, a very weak and relatively ineffective way, but enough to allow the body to build its own clot, let's say. Beyond clotting, the biofoam must also seal and encapsulate the wound, and this would support that initial polyethylene cover or cap to any wounds that are there. But it will be more than just expanding foam. It must to some extent bond to the surrounding tissues to provide that support. Now this is both good and bad. To create an adhesive that seals the wound, and certainly to ensure the foam adheres to local cells or tissues, it must have certain features that are not so easily explained. The foam can expand as we've shown, but getting it to create a seal is very hard. Remembering that the body is quite squishy. It is basically a protein bag filled with water, or at least largely filled with water. And because of this, it's very mobile, it moves, and tissue will be pushed away rather than adhere to something that's trying to force into it, in this case the expanding foam. And so you need more than just expansion, you need a certain amount of adhesion. The most likely explanation in this case is that the biofoam forms a hydrogel. A hydrogel is a combination of a polymer, like polyethylene, products, and a liquid. In this case, the liquid element can be provided by the injury, wound, or local tissue. This would also explain why the foam is not a problem when applied to the skin when intact, but does behave very differently when applied to an open wound. An open wound has plenty of liquid available in the form of blood, typically, to react with, whereas a sealed skin is not going to have that same amount of liquid to react with. There may be superficial oils or maybe sweat, but not necessarily anywhere near the quantity required to have a reaction occur. That's also supported by the fact a polymer, in this case for a hydrogel, needs to be semi-permeable. This is possible with short polymers, such as polyethylene. The polymer supports local tissue, seals the wound, and adheres to the outside of the injury. You have at the very periphery on the inside a sort of hydrogel interface between the polymer and the tissue, allowing it to adhere. You have the polyethylene acting as a sort of clot which goes into the local vascular tissue to some extent, and importantly, you have it being able to react only inside the area of the wound, where blood is, for instance. The triphosphates that are attached to this would also contribute to it, particularly because they're attached to the polyethylene. It would not only contribute to the adhesion of the particular polymer we're talking about, but also contribute to structural integrity. While part of the polyethylene, it acts as a sort of support. The various phosphates involved reach out and bridge up to 3 different polymer chains, allowing you to get a very complex interconnecting web, more like a fishing net than a branch, let's say. Where a tree has many branches going out from a main trunk, this would rather have all of the different parts of it connected in 3 different dimensions, thereby allowing for the phosphates, let's say, to create a more complex 3-dimensional structure that would fill the wound and also expand to fill that wound, importantly. And next is the antimicrobial and likely very much antibacterial compounds that are within it. The first possible product is actually the nitrous oxide, remembering that in part it will be caught within the expanding foam initially, but there will also be a certain amount that either escapes out of it or in other instances is simply expelled out of the canister as it goes. Nitrous oxide has been shown to have certain antibacterial properties. Simply put, the nitrous oxide acts as a source of highly reactive oxygen species. These in turn damage the bacteria because too much oxygen is bad. The process is not necessarily unique to just bacteria though. It can also affect fungi, viruses, protozoa, and just about anything else you can imagine, even the local tissue to some extent. The most effective way, though, would be to use actual dedicated antimicrobials within the chemical itself. The problem is that the biofoam is a shelf-stable product. That means it might be sitting unused for a very long time. Imagine how much time there is between a ship going into space, in the case of the Halo universe, and it, say, getting engaged in combat, meaning the foam needs to be used. It may be years or even decades in some cases. That means that the antimicrobials will degrade over time, and it makes it very hard to keep them stable and effective for this long without dedicated storage. A dedicated storage just isn't going to happen with something that sits on a wall waiting to be used. Assuming the magic of miraculous future biomedical technology that creates antimicrobials that can survive long-term storage in uncertain conditions isn't the answer, it's not necessarily impossible, and certainly possibly the case, that the condensed nitrous oxide within the canister could be contributing to the long-term storage. That's simply because it is very cold. Very, very cold. This would extend the time frame the antimicrobials would be functional for far longer, and that would explain why they work long after they've initially been put into storage in the cylinder or similar. Again, we have another product related to nitrous oxide. It's the numbing effect. In fact, it's a well-known gas used for dental surgery. Does anyone remember the masochistic dentist from Little Shop of Horrors? The thing they were huffing? Nitrous oxide. The mechanism by which nitrous oxide prevents pain is not entirely known, but generally there are mechanisms that are recognized. It's broadly understood to relate to ion and ligand-gated channels. In simpler terms, the neurons in the area of the injury have various channels on the cell surface. These are needed to make the neuron work and transmit a signal. Once you block or otherwise inhibit these functions, the neuron is unable to, well, not necessarily sense, but unable to communicate that there's any pain that's occurred. The problem for this is that the effect is not exactly selective. Now, depending on how severe the injury is, the likelihood of a soldier going back into combat after being given a canister of this to use is relatively small, but there are instances where we see the soldiers going straight back into fighting after being injured and administered this, primarily the Spartans. That means we need to look at something that is more selective, and it brings us to the other possibility, the morphoamphetamine compound. For simplicity, let's assume that the morpho part of morphoamphetamine is referencing some sort of morphine-like compound. Not necessarily morphine, but likely an opioid of some description. Opioids can be slightly more selective in this case. Part of the selectivity is driven by the local application of the biofoam. The direct application means only local tissues exposed to the opioid antagonist or agonist, and therefore the opioid receptor is only activated in the local area. This is important again, as it would theoretically mean you only get a local sense of pain relief, but there's a problem still. Unlike most standard readily available opioids, such as morphine, we have something that's very selective, it seems, and most current opioid-type products are not selective. Now, we could be looking at a new opioid target, and this is where one possibility comes into play, the G protein receptor, rather than the whole family of opioid receptors. By doing it this way, it is much more selective, and very importantly, by targeting the G protein part of the pathway, you get analgesia or pain relief, but don't interfere with the motor function of the individual. This is basically achieving the best possible outcome. It does also support its use, particularly by Spartans, where there is a inbuilt administration of biofoam within the Mjolnir suit. And now we have the cause of the pain when it's first administered, that feeling of burning or ants biting after applying the biofoam. Part of this is that the pressure of the biofoam in local tissue will trigger the same sort of result as a paper cut. You literally have the force on the wound will be the same sort of thing as you would experience, and certainly the pain from it, as say for instance trying to apply pressure to someone bleeding out. But the other thing is there's going to be an almost a paper cut-like phenomena. Those small polyethylene compounds, those small bits of plastic basically, will be segments that will behave like paper as they can theoretically cut and tear their way into the local tissue to help with securing the foam in place. The fact that it does not penetrate the skin of a sealed wound is also why it wouldn't hurt in that case. There is far less reaction to observe, simply because there is a lack of liquid to cause the polymer to become available and certainly be driven into the local tissue, let's say, by the expansion of the nitrous oxide. The pain and certainly effectiveness is partly driven by the delivery mechanism, and that is the being sprayed onto, or in some cases into, a wound, or being applied on the surface of a wound like shaving foam. The differences are rather significant, and it's because we have it delivered two ways. It's unusual for a treatment like this to work two ways, where it is not a very generic thing. For example, a bandage can be used to wrap, pack, or seal a wound. That is because it is generic. It's not really anything that can be, let's say, specially applied. It's basically meant to be a jack of all trades. But in this case, biofoam is also being a jack of all trades, but also a specialist. It's primarily for hemorrhage to start with. Because of that, it is rather more difficult to be able to look at it in the same way. It's both much more specific manner for which it is used, and certainly a much more active product, let's say. This is why the biofoam is arguably applied as a topical treatment, first of all. For example, sealing burns from plasma weapons. The effect is only going to work until the wound heals, or the biofoam eventually wears off. The situation is effectively similar to how gauze and bandages are used today. The difference is that it only applies to the wound area, similar to how you might put putty to fill a gap or crack in something. But the other side of it is for deeper wounds. For example, needle or shard rounds, beam rifle wounds, and even kinetic energy weapons, and wounds from human projectile weapons for that matter. These are deeper and much bigger. To make it work in this scenario, the biofoam must be injected into the depth of the wound. To ensure the foam works as intended, you would need to inject a bolus, or a big single amount, into the wound, and then quickly withdraw the injector. But we don't really see that. Therefore, we need to look at the other possible pathway that they could be using, or mechanism. That is, unless the foam has a delayed expansion above and beyond the initial period delivered by the change of liquid to gas nitrous oxide. That is, you inject the initial amount, and as it expands, the injector is removed, and then there is a delayed extra expansion that fills the void left over from removing the injector. This would ensure that the wound is filled from the very bottom to the very top, even though there was an area within it that should be a void from the injector of the canister. Next, of course, is the short duration of biofoam. Biofoam is supposedly only going to work for a few hours, and this is why it is a first aid treatment and not a medical treatment. That temporary effect is something much harder to achieve. Remember that you want a strong and effective treatment that is contradictory with temporary measures. For example, a lot of clotting packs that are used become somewhat stuck inside the wound because of the nature of what happens when the blood begins to coagulate. You want that as the first aid measure, but you don't want to leave it there because it creates problems down the track with regards to treatment. You basically have a foreign object embedded in a wound. That's why the temporary measure here is good, but you also get a very strong result when it's used. The simplest method to achieve this is that the limited quantity of the initial active ingredients, nitrous oxide, opioid antagonists, microbial products, and more. As they require a cold environment, in the case of nitrous oxide a condensed form, to remain, the increase in temperature and exposure to air allows them to warm up and sublimate into a gas. That means they either break down from that, they break down due to heat, they run out, or they evaporate away. This would explain certainly some of what we see, particularly the fact that the foam doesn't keep on expanding continuously. This does leave us with one thing: a polymer foam mass in the wound. Sure, the pain relief may be gone, which you may be regretting, the antimicrobial features may not be required anymore, or it may be too late anyway, but you still have a fairly solid foam mass that is plugging the wound, and that mass is a problem. How do you make it go away? The inner cynic says that the movement of writhing and agony will cause the foam to eventually dislodge from the wound site, but that's not really consistent with what we see inside of the Halo universe. But we would expect to see this to some extent anyway, and it's because even with the most powerful of connections or adhesion to the local tissue, you're not going to have a perfect, let's say, a connection between the foam plug and the human body. And it's also not really something we would expect to have perfectly demonstrated anyway. If we had that, it wouldn't really be first aid, it would be something far more permanent, far more problematic. And as a result, it's not really likely to be the case, again, particularly related to the fact that although most people receiving this would be out of combat and taken away to some sort of first aid station, we do have individuals like the Spartans who basically go straight back into combat and very actively into combat. And they are the individuals where we would expect to see the adhesion between the foam plug and the tissues be most stressed. That leads us to two options: a time-released or effect or similar, and this could either be granules of an anticoagulant product, and these anticoagulant products would basically be housed in the foam that's released, but once they're exposed to the air, they would gradually break down, similar to how some medications consumed orally have a delayed coating to allow either slow release or to survive exposure to an initial thing like stomach acid, where they can then be absorbed in the intestine without damaging the content. The other way for this is that the triphosphates attached to the polyethylene are responsible for the structure degrading, remembering that they're very much responsible for the three-dimensionality of the polymer as it is to form that foam plug. The phosphate, and particularly triphosphates, are well known to being somewhat reactive. But importantly, those triphosphates, as they break down, form an acid. This would in turn cause the polymer, the polyethylene, to break down and cease being a polymer, and that would cause the foam plug to basically begin collapsing in on itself, theoretically from the inside out, meaning the outer hard shell would be the last thing to go, theoretically maximizing the duration of the effect. And now we have to discuss the healing properties of the biofoam on a short-term basis. The effect of adding nitrous oxide to the mix leads to the expansion or dilation of the local blood vessels. Increased blood flow means the healing can occur quicker. In typical injuries, this is seen as edema. A simple example that can be understood by most people is how a cat scratch becomes inflamed and raised. This is the same process, just more localized and specific. This would also contribute somewhat to the allergic reaction in the form of edema. Basically, some people have let's say, a greater propensity to react a certain way to the, well, in this instance, it's the nitrous oxide. Why it's important is that it helps not only with healing, but importantly with the immediate healing. Dilating blood vessels means more platelets get delivered to the injury site. The same mechanisms also deliver more immunoglobulins, chemokines, and more that all tell the body to deliver more immune cells and healing factors. This will help to create a natural platelet plug and the various other factors that help once the biofoam ends. The other is that the edema from this process will also increase and improve the rate at which the biofoam not just creates the biogel plug, but also the reaction and expansion of the foam. Remembering, more fluid entering into the area should increase the reaction rate. Edema should increase the movement of water from inside blood vessels, permeating out into local tissues, and then from local tissues into the injury site. Related to the healing properties is the question of how does it deal with major internal damage. For example, if you're wounded in a major organ like the lungs, something dangerous like the intestines, or just simply a big wound that would and should otherwise cause shock. In short, a large hole in your body should unsurprisingly be bad for you. For some reason unknown to modern science and medicine, large unexpected holes in the human body are counterproductive to health. It's just one of those great mysteries of life we'll never know the answer to, but the result generally is shock, followed shortly by death. That raises a very big and obvious question about how the biofoam deals with this. The first point is simply shock, and it's generally shock from blood loss. The first step is sealing the wound or staunching it. It's just as would be done with any other typical case in the modern world, or at least our world. That would stop the blood flow and therefore blood loss. No blood loss, or at least drastically reduced blood loss, means reduced risk of shock. Now this is all well and good if the individual is treated quickly and early. If not, however, we have a problem, and this is generally where follow-up is required. But follow-up is also the problem. How do you deal with the blood lost from the wound and make up for it? And to be blunt, there's just no way for this to happen with the biofoam as it's depicted. This means we have one major flaw with biofoam that cannot be overcome with everything established so far. Last, we have the over-the-counter status of biofoam. A biofoam is a drug for all intents and purposes. However, it is a drug that you can buy without a prescription. That means it must be fairly safe to use. At least, as safe to use as drugs with no obvious risk of immediate issues. Yes, it can happen, but it would generally be safe. The reason in this case is, well, fairly straightforward to be clear. The opioids in this are not accessible as a drug that can be abused, the same way that ephedrine, OxyContin, and the more prescribed medications can be. And that's because it's in a foam. If you want to huff the foam, you're more likely to suffocate to death than you are to get a high. That also means that, say, unlike aerosol paint, such as spray paint, you cannot use it to get high. It's just a physical impossibility. And the other products within it, for example, the nitrous oxide, can't be used in the same way. Further, it is really only applicable to wounds, and typically either superficial or major wounds. It's not going to make much difference. But it's pretty much limited to only wounds where you use it as is. You can't repurpose it, you can't extract the active ingredients or anything else. It's pretty much an equivalent product to a modern clotting pack, except modern clotting packs typically have a degree of shelf life, whereas this doesn't appear to have. Overall, this makes biofoam a viable product for the most part. It works in just about every way it is shown to. The problem is that the not shown elements are far more significant, and certainly far more of a problem. The biggest being shock. In every other respect, whether it is the foam forming a clot, analgesia, antimicrobial properties and more, everything kind of works. Admittedly, the degree to which it works is a bit questionable, and we certainly had to go down the speculative pathway further than we'd care for, but it is entirely feasible. And as such, we'd give this a 9 out of 10 overall. It's not perfect, but it's as close as we'd expect to see for any kind of general video game like this, particularly one without a more solid scientific foundation. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below